Picture this. You're a 25-year-old general who got crushed 2 years ago. The enemy who destroyed you is now marching toward your fortress with 50,000 warriors, twice your numbers. Their commander just sent you a message. Prepare me a bath and lunch inside your fortress tomorrow. I'll be dining in Dara after I destroy you. Your cavalry is inferior. Your infantry is unreliable in open combat. The Persian immortals' elite heavy cavalry, encased head to toe in iron, with face masks designed to terrify, have never lost a major field battle against Rome in over a century. Every tactical manual says retreat. Every veteran says abandon the fortress. Every probability calculation says you die tomorrow. So what do? If you're Belisarius, you order your men to start digging. Not walls, not ramparts, trenches. Geometric patterns of trenches that will turn mathematics and engineering into weapons more deadly than any sword. This is June 530 AD. This is the Battle of Dara. And this is the day a young general who'd already tasted humiliating defeat proved that prepared ground multiplies force, that geometry defeats cavalry, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't what you carry, it's what you dig. By the end of this story, you'll understand how documented tactical innovation allowed 25,000 men to defeat 50,000. Why an eyewitness account by Procopius of Caesarea, one of history's most detailed battle descriptions, reveals engineering principles that would influence warfare for 1,000 years. How trenches positioned at precise angles created overlapping fields of fire that turned Persian numerical superiority into a fatal weakness. But first, you need to understand the 3 crises that made this war inevitable. Because in 526 AD, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Sassanid Persian Empire were on a collision course, driven by religion, wounded pride, and one fortress that sat like a dagger, pointed at Persia's heart. The first crisis erupted in the mountains of Georgia, the Iberian Rebellion where Christians refused to expose their dead to birds instead of proper burial, where religious persecution became geopolitical confrontation, where Rome's promise to defend co-religionists made Persia view Byzantine interference as intolerable. The second crisis involved an adoption scheme that could have given a Persian prince legal claim to the Byzantine throne. Emperor Justin Bersezd Quaestor saw the trap. Under Roman law, an adopted son has the same rights as a biological heir. This creates exactly the succession crisis it's designed to prevent. The diplomatic insult that followed, offering barbarian adoption instead of proper Roman adoption, wounded Persian pride so deeply that war became inevitable. The third crisis? A fortress called Dara, built in direct violation of peace treaty, sitting 18 kilometers from Persia's own fortress of Nisibis. For Byzantium, a shield protecting the wealthy Syrian provinces. For Persia, an intolerable provocation that had to be destroyed. By 529, these 3 crises merged into one. When Emperor Justinian inherited the throne, he didn't apologize for treaty violations. He strengthened Dara further. Shah Kavad I responded by sending 40,000 men with orders to erase the fortress from the map entirely. To stop them, Justinian turned to a young general who'd already lost once, who'd been humiliated, who'd spent 2 years analyzing exactly why he lost. Belisarius was about to turn his enemy's own tactics against them with geometric precision they'd never imagined. Meet Flavius Belisarius, born around 500 to 505 AD, somewhere in Thrace or Illyria. Exact location lost to history. By age 25, he commanded 25,000 men. For context, the typical age for a Byzantine general was 35. His rapid promotion was remarkable. His previous record was catastrophic. Here's what most histories don't tell you. Belisarius had already failed, spectacularly. In 528, at a place called the Neuris, Persian forces under a commander named Xerxes crushed his army. Multiple sources confirm the defeat, though tactical details are sparse. But here's what makes this defeat critical. Belisarius didn't just lose. He studied why he lost. For the next 2 years, stationed at Dara as its commander, he analyzed the tactical principles that had defeated him. The Persians had used field fortifications, trenches, and obstacles that channeled the Byzantine attack into killing zones and neutralized Byzantine cavalry mobility. They'd negated his advantages by forcing the fight onto ground of their choosing. They'd multiplied their force through engineering. Think about what that meant psychologically. You're a 25-year-old general who just suffered humiliating defeat. You could blame luck, enemy numbers, your soldiers. Instead, Belisarius recognized something more valuable. He'd been outthought, not outfought. His family background remains mysterious. Procopius, the eyewitness chronicler who would travel with Belisarius and document his campaigns, typically noted when important figures came from humble origins. He explicitly mentioned the modest backgrounds of Emperor Justinian, Empress Theodora, and Belisarius's wife, Antonina. But for Belisarius himself, silence. Historians interpret this as suggesting possibly comfortable or even noble origins. What we know for certain: he joined the Byzantine army as a teenager, served in Emperor Justin the Merz's elite bodyguard, the Excubatores, and his friendship with Justinian, Justin's nephew and heir, undoubtedly helped his career. When Justinian began consolidating power, he needed loyal military commanders on the dangerous eastern frontier. Belisarius, talented and personally connected to the future emperor, was appointed to Eastern Command in 527. That same year brought his first test and first failure. He and another general were sent into Persian territory with orders to demonstrate Byzantine military resolve. The campaign was a disaster. They were defeated and forced to retreat. Then came Thanurus in 528, the battle that would define everything that followed. Here's what Belisarius recognized during those 2 years at Dara that his contemporaries missed. He was not commanding the Roman legions of antiquity. His infantry, while professional, lacked the discipline and armor to stand in open field combat against Persian Savaran elite heavy cavalry recruited from Persian nobility who'd trained for warfare since childhood as a hereditary military caste. His own cavalry was qualitatively inferior to Persian armored lancers. Every straightforward engagement favored the Persians. His strategic assessment, inferred from his later tactical choices, was brutally honest. I cannot match their strength, so I must control how they use it. If I fight on open ground using traditional tactics, I lose. If I can dictate the geometry of the battlefield through engineering, I can negate their advantages. Think about that mindset shift. Most generals would demand better soldiers, more equipment, reinforcements. Belisarius demanded shovels. By 530, when Persian forces marched on Dara again, they weren't just confident, they were calculated. The Persian general leading them embodied everything Belisarius was not: aristocratic, experienced, undefeated. Perozes belonged to the House of Miran, one of the 7 great noble clans of the Sassanid Empire. When Procopius recorded the Persian commander's name, he noted his title as Meranes. Modern scholarship has corrected this misunderstanding. Meranes wasn't a rank, it was the family name. The House of Mihran had served as hereditary margraves of Ray, near modern Tehran, for 3 centuries. Multiple members of the family had commanded Persian armies in the endless wars against Rome. This wasn't professional military service. This was dynastic tradition. The confidence Perozes brought to Dara wasn't arrogance in the sense of irrational overestimation. It was calculation based on documented historical reality. The Sassanid Empire had not been defeated in a major field engagement by Byzantine forces in over a century. Recent battles reinforced Persian superiority. The crushing of the Iberian revolt, the defeat of Belisarius himself at the Eurus just 2 years earlier, the successful blocking of Byzantine fortification efforts throughout 527 to 528. The pattern was clear. Persian military dominance over Byzantine forces was an established fact. The instrument of that dominance rode with Peroses, the Jayadan, the Immortals. Byzantine sources, supported by archaeological evidence, described these elite warriors in terms that sound almost mythological, but were terrifyingly real. They were encased from head to toe in thick iron plates. Their helmets featured skillfully fitted human face masks, elaborate protection with tiny openings for eyes and nostrils, designed both to protect and to psychologically unnerve opponents. They rode Nisaean chargers, large Iranian horses bred for centuries for endurance and power, capable of carrying the tremendous weight of fully armored cavalry. Their primary weapon was the kontos, a heavy lance 12 to 14 feet long, designed to be couched under the arm and driven through enemy formations with the momentum of an armored warhorse. The physics were simple and devastating. 1,500 pounds of horse and armored rider, moving at speed, focused through a steel point, could shatter infantry formations and unhorse opposing cavalry. The Immortals also carried composite bows, swords, and maces as secondary weapons. They were the Sassanid Shah's personal bodyguard and the Empire's ultimate shock troops. The traditional strength was 10,000 men, though exact numbers present at Dara aren't recorded in surviving sources. Supporting the elite cavalry was the bulk of the Persian army, the Savaran nobility fighting as Klibinari ovenmen, so nicknamed because their extensive mail and lamellar armor, covering their entire bodies, became dangerously hot under the Mesopotamian sun. Then came light cavalry, a mix of lesser Persian nobility, fighting as horse archers and nomadic mercenaries from the steppes. The infantry, the Paean, were mostly conscripted peasants. Procopius famously described them as a crowd of pitiable peasants who come into battle for no other purpose than to dig through walls and to despoil the slain. The Persian force also included elephants imported from India, massive creatures that contemporary sources called moving hills, positioned to instill terror and disrupt enemy formations. Procopius records the message Peroses sent to Belisarius before the battle, revealing the Persian mindset perfectly. Prepare a bath and lunch inside Dara for tomorrow. I'll be dining in the fortress after destroying you. This was psychological warfare, but also simple statement of probability. 40,000 Persian warriors marching from Nisibis, just 5 kilometers away. Reinforcements bringing Persian strength to 50,000, against 25,000 Byzantines with inferior cavalry and unreliable infantry. The mathematics seemed inescapable. What the Persians couldn't know from their reconnaissance, was that the ground between their camp and Dara had been transformed. While they'd been setting up camp at Amodius, 5 kilometers away, Byzantine soldiers had been digging, and the young general they'd defeated at the Eurus had designed something that would turn their strengths into fatal vulnerabilities. Modern archaeologists working at the Dara battlefield site discovered something that transforms our understanding of ancient military engineering. Stone markers along trench lines, identified in Christopher Lillington Martin's 2007 survey, proved that Belisarius's defensive system wasn't improvised field fortification. It was calculated geometry designed to funnel 50,000 men into killing zones where Byzantine advantages in archery and defensive positioning would neutralize Persian superiority in armored cavalry charges. The trench system Belisarius ordered constructed was revolutionary not because it was complex, though it was, but because it represented a fundamental rethinking of how engineering could multiply force. Procopius provides an unusually detailed description of the layout, and his account, confirmed by archaeological evidence, reveals sophisticated understanding of tactical mathematics. This wasn't a straight defensive line. The central section, positioned directly in front of Dara's walls, was short and straight, but crucially, it was recessed. Belisarius positioned this central trench several yards behind the level of the flanking sections, creating what military historians call a refused center. From the ends of this central trench, two perpendicular transverse sections extended forward. These prevented Persian cavalry from easily sweeping around the flanks of the central infantry position. From the ends of these transverse sections, two more straight trenches extended outward toward the hills that flanked the valley on each side. The overall shape created a defensive system that was both static and dynamic. The refused center invited Persian attacks on the forward wings, where Byzantine cavalry waited behind their own protective trenches. Any Persian force attacking these wings would be exposed to crossfire from the recessed central position and from artillery on Dara's walls. Meanwhile, the forward position of the wings meant Byzantine cavalry could launch counterattacks that would strike Persian formations in the flank while they were still organizing their assault on the center. But the most tactically sophisticated feature was the bridges, numerous passages of earth left intact across the trenches, wide enough for small units of Byzantine cavalry to cross in controlled sorties, but too narrow for massed Persian cavalry charges. This meant Byzantines could attack, then retreat behind protection of trenches, while Persians attempting to pursue would be forced to compress into columns that destroyed their formation cohesion and made them vulnerable to archery. Historical sources, particularly scholar Irfan Shahid, confirmed that Belisarius had learned this tactic from the Persians themselves at Thanuris in 528, where he'd been defeated. Persian forces had used a trench system to channel and defeat his attack. Belisarius had spent 2 years analyzing why that system worked. His innovation at Dara was to take the Persian defensive concept and enhance it with geometric complexity that created overlapping fields of fire and divided any attacking force into separate sectors that couldn't mutually support each other. The tactical mathematics were elegant. The trenches absorbed the kinetic energy of cavalry charges, forcing horses to slow or jump, disrupting the momentum that made armored cavalry devastating. The system divided the Persian army into 3 distinct sectors: right wing, center, and left wing, preventing coordinated assaults. Most importantly, the system gave the Byzantines interior lines. They could move reserves to reinforce any threatened point faster than the Persians could maneuver around the obstacles. The trap was set, the geometry was perfect, and the Persians were about to march straight into it. Behind this geometric framework, Belisarius positioned his forces with precision that reveals his understanding of his army's strengths and weaknesses. The center behind the recessed central trench, and close enough to city walls to receive covering fire from Dara's artillery, held the Byzantine infantry, 10,000 to 12,000 men that Belisarius himself assessed as unreliable in open field combat. By anchoring them to fortifications and artillery support, he negated their weakness. Think about that brutal honesty. He knew his infantry couldn't match Persian quality, so he didn't ask them to. He asked them to stand behind trenches with walls at their backs. On the left wing, behind the forward left trench, Belisarius positioned cavalry under the command of Bouzes. But the real tactical sophistication lay in the layered positioning. At the interior angle where the left trench met the transverse section, he positioned 300 Hun cavalry under commanders named Sunakaz and Agan. These weren't Byzantine troops, but mercenary steppe warriors, expert horse archers whose mobility and firepower would be critical, and in a position that wouldn't become apparent until battle was joined. 300 Heruli cavalry, under a commander named Ferris, were concealed behind a hill on the far left flank, completely invisible to Persian reconnaissance. The right wing mirrored this structure, cavalry behind the forward right trench. Another 300 Huns under commanders Simas and Askan at the interior angle. Behind the center, Belisarius kept his most valuable asset in reserve, his personal bucellari, household cavalry, commanded by John the Armenian, described in sources as Belisarius's boyhood companion and a man of considerable talent. These elite troops, perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 of the best equipped and best trained cavalry in the Byzantine army, would remain uncommitted until the decisive moment. Belisarius established his command post in the center, where he could observe the entire battlefield and commit his reserves to whichever sector needed them most. This was the final advantage his system created. Unity of command and interior lines allowed him to fight a flexible battle, responding to developments faster than the more rigid Persian command structure could adapt. The first day after the Persian army's arrival, the 40,000 warriors deployed roughly 4 kilometers from the fortress and drew up their battle lines in full view of Byzantine defenders. The message was clear: we are here. We are overwhelming. You are already defeated. But they didn't attack. Instead, something happened that Procopius's account preserves in unusual detail, something that would shake Persian confidence before the main battle even began. A single Persian knight rode forward, challenging any Byzantine to face him in single combat. What happened next became one of the most disputed stories in the historical record. According to Procopius, the man who accepted the challenge was not a professional warrior, but a bath attendant or wrestling trainer named Andreas, serving with the Byzantine commander Buzes. The account claims Andreas had been secretly training with Belisarius's household troopers and used wrestling technique rather than pure martial skill to unhorse the Persian champion. When a second, larger Persian champion emerged, Andreas allegedly repeated the feat. Modern historians express skepticism about the literal historicity of this account. It may be literary device rather than documentary fact. What we know with certainty: the first day ended without general engagement. The Persians camped at Amodius, roughly 5 kilometers from Dara. Whatever occurred, whether specific single combats or simply mutual observation and psychological maneuvering, both sides spent the night preparing for the decisive encounter they knew would come the next day. That night, Belisarius made a decision revealing his understanding of psychological warfare. He sent a letter to Perozes, proposing their disputes be settled through negotiation rather than combat. The letter read in part, "The first blessing is peace, as is agreed by all men who have even a small share of reason. The best general, therefore, is that one which is able to bring about peace from war." Historical debate surrounds Belisarius's motivation for that peace letter. Some historians interpret it as evidence that Belisarius doubted his chances of victory, given the numerical disparity. Others attribute it to genuine desire to avoid bloodshed. A third interpretation, supported by the psychological dynamics that followed, is that Belisarius was conducting calculated psychological warfare. He knew the letter would be rejected. He knew it would increase Persian confidence to dangerous levels, the kind of overconfidence that leads to tactical mistakes. Perozes' response was exactly what Belisarius might have predicted. The Persian commander dismissed the offer with contempt and reiterated his demand for a bath and lunch inside Dara the following day. To the Persians, who already viewed the Byzantine army as second-rate, and who now possessed a 50,000 to 25,000 numerical advantage, with the arrival of 10,000 reinforcements from Nisibis, Belisarius's letter looked like desperation. The Persians spent the night confident. The Byzantines spent it preparing. Because when dawn broke on day 2, the real killing would begin, and the geometry Belisarius had created would reveal its purpose in ways that would stun chroniclers on both sides and influence military tactics for centuries to come. Dawn on the second day brought with it 10,000 Persian reinforcements marching from Nisibis. Procopius records that these troops arrived in the morning, bringing total Persian strength to 50,000 men, arrayed against Belisarius's 25,000. The 2-to-1 numerical disadvantage was now confirmed and visible. From the walls of Dara, Byzantine soldiers could see the Persian army spreading across the valley, a mass of cavalry and infantry that seemed to have no end. Perozes made a calculated decision about timing. Rather than attack at first light when troops were fresh, he delayed the engagement until late morning, approaching midday. The calculation was based on understanding Mediterranean military customs. Roman and Byzantine armies typically ate their main meal earlier in the day. By waiting until the hottest part of the day, Perozes ensured his enemies would be fighting hungry, thirsty, and exhausted by heat. It was sound tactical thinking based on exploiting known patterns of enemy behavior. The Persian deployment followed classical combined arms doctrine perfected over centuries of warfare. The elite immortals were positioned on both wings of the forward line, backed by sovereign heavy cavalry and supported by detachments of light horse archers, including allied Arab cavalry. The cavalry on the left wing was commanded by an officer the sources call Bersmanas, described in some accounts as one-eyed. The right wing was under the command of Pittacus. The center held the mass of infantry, the Paihan peasant levies, positioned to fill space and provide a reservoir of bodies if needed. War elephants were positioned to support the cavalry charges, their psychological impact designed to disrupt enemy formations before the shock of armored lancers hit home. From Perozes' perspective on the Persian side, the battlefield looked exactly as he wanted it, open enough for cavalry maneuvers. The Byzantine forces visible behind their trenches, no surprises apparent. What he couldn't see from his position was the precise geometry of those trenches, the hidden Heruli cavalry behind the hill on his right, or the full tactical implications of the refused center Belisarius had created. To Persian eyes, the trenches looked like standard defensive works, obstacles to be overcome through superior numbers and armored force. The morning air was thick with dust and the smell of sulfur from the hot springs that gave this region its character. 50,000 men and thousands of horses created their own weather system, dust clouds that caught the light, the sound of armor and weapons that carried across the valley. For the Byzantine defenders, the sight must have been psychologically crushing. Wave after wave of cavalry, banners of the great Persian noble houses, the glint of sun on iron armor, stretching across the entire visible battlefield. But Belisarius had one advantage that wasn't visible from across the valley. He'd done this before, not won before, lost before. At the Nuris, he'd been on the other side, attacking into a prepared defensive position. And he'd learned how quickly confidence could turn into catastrophe when geometry replaced brute force as the decisive factor. Then came the sound that announced the beginning. Persian cavalry advancing at a trot, closing the distance, preparing to demonstrate why the Sassanid Empire had dominated this frontier for over a century. The Battle of Dara had begun. The battle opened not with a cavalry charge, but with what Procopius describes as a massive exchange of missile fire. Both sides had positioned archers, Byzantine light infantry, and Hun mercenaries on one side, Persian horse archers and infantry archers on the other. The scale of the barrage was such that Procopius uses vivid language to describe it. The missiles made a vast cloud over the battlefield. For perhaps half an hour, thousands of arrows arced through the air while the main cavalry forces held position, waiting for the archery to weaken enemy formations before committing to the shock of close combat. The Persians had numerical superiority in archers, as they did in virtually every category of troop type. By pure mathematics of arrows fired per minute, the Persians should have inflicted heavier casualties and forced the Byzantines to either abandon their positions or take devastating losses before the real fighting even began. But something happened that ancient sources attributed to divine favor, and modern military historians attribute to meteorology. The wind was blowing against the Persians. Procopius specifically records this environmental factor, and it's too specific a detail to dismiss as invention. Wind direction dramatically affects arrow warfare. Arrows fired with the wind maintain velocity and can even achieve greater than normal range. Arrows fired against the wind lose velocity, drop short, or have their trajectories deflected. The Byzantine positions, backed up against Dara's walls, had the wind at their backs. The Persian archers, firing from the open valley, were shooting into the wind. The result was that many Persian arrows fell short of Byzantine lines, or arrived with reduced force, less capable of penetrating armor or shields. Meanwhile, Byzantine arrows maintained their killing power. Think about the psychology of this moment. You're a Persian archer. You've never lost a major battle. You outnumber the enemy 2-1. You fire thousands of arrows that should be decimating their ranks. But the wind's simple, random meteorology is turning your numerical superiority into tactical irrelevance. Your arrows fall short. Theirs reach you just fine. The archery duel, which should have decisively favored the Persians, resulted in what Procopius describes as minor casualties on each side, a tactical draw that must have frustrated Persian commanders who'd expected their numerical superiority to dominate even this preliminary phase. This was the first indication that something about this battlefield wasn't behaving as Persian tactical doctrine predicted. In their experience, superior numbers translated directly into superior results across all phases of combat. The trenches might slow cavalry charges, but arrows should fly the same regardless of field engineering. Yet even the archery exchange was somehow not producing the expected outcome. After the arrow storm diminished, both sides running low on immediately available ammunition, and neither having achieved decisive advantage, the time came for what Persian tactical doctrine had perfected over centuries: the massed cavalry charge. The Savaran and Immortals existed for this moment. Their armor, their training, their horses, their lances, everything about them was designed to break enemy formations through overwhelming armored force. The mathematics were simple. Kinetic energy equals mass times velocity squared. 1,500 pounds of horse and rider moving at speed, multiplied by hundreds of cavalry in close formation, created a shock wave that could shatter infantry lines and scatter opposing cavalry. Perozes made his first major tactical commitment. He ordered a cavalry probe against the Byzantine left wing, the forward position, defended by Buzis and his cavalry. The choice of target makes tactical sense. Test the defenses, identify weaknesses. If the Byzantine left collapsed quickly, the entire defensive system would unravel. The Persian cavalry under Pittacus advanced, picking up speed, lances leveled, heading directly for the Byzantine positions. From the Byzantine perspective, this must have been terrifying. Hundreds of armored cavalry thundering toward you, the ground shaking, the sound alone enough to break morale. This was the moment when armies broke and ran, when the psychological pressure of imminent destruction overcame discipline and survival instinct took over. But the trenches changed the mathematics. As the Persian cavalry reached the defensive works, they had three choices: attempt to jump the trenches, try to force through the narrow passages, or pull up short and reform. What they couldn't do was maintain the cohesive formation and momentum that made shock cavalry devastating. Some attempted to cross. Horses, no matter how well trained, hesitate before obstacles. That hesitation broke the charge's rhythm. Some made it across. Most did not. The passages Belisarius had left in the trenches became congestion points where cavalry bunched up, losing formation, becoming targets for Byzantine archers rather than an unstoppable force. The Byzantine cavalry, under Buzis, positioned behind the protective trench, could choose when and where to engage. They weren't forced to receive a charge in the open, but could fight from a position of relative safety, sorting out through the passages when opportunity arose, and falling back behind protection when pressed. But Perozes had committed only a probe, not his full strength. As the first cavalry attack developed, he'd learned something more valuable than a quick victory. He'd learned where the Byzantine defenses were strong and where they might be vulnerable. What he was about to learn, though he didn't realize it yet, was that the trenches weren't the only surprise Belisarius had prepared. Hidden behind a hill on the Byzantine left flank, 300 Heruli cavalry under Pharis had been waiting in complete concealment since dawn, and positioned at the angle where the Byzantine trenches met, 300 Hun cavalry under Sunikaz and Igon had been holding their position, waiting for exactly this moment when Persian cavalry would be committed, extended, and vulnerable to attacks they couldn't see coming. The geometry was about to become a killing ground. The Persian cavalry probe against the Byzantine left quickly escalated from reconnaissance and force to full commitment. As Pittacus's cavalry managed to force some crossings of the trench and began pushing back Buzez's defenders, Perozes made the decision to reinforce success. More Persian cavalry poured into the attack, pressing the advantage, sensing that the Byzantine left wing might collapse if enough pressure was applied quickly enough. This is exactly what Belisarius had designed the forward trench positions to invite: Persian commitment to attacking the wings, while the refused center waited, creating angles of fire and, more importantly, creating the conditions for the hidden forces to strike. Procopius records the sequence with unusual precision as the Persian right wing pushed forward. Believing they were on the verge of breaking through, two things happened simultaneously that transformed their attack into catastrophe. From behind the hill on the far left of the Byzantine line, Pharis's 300 Heruli cavalry emerged and struck the Persian rear. At almost the same moment, Sunikas's and Igon's 300 Hun cavalry, positioned at the interior angle of the Byzantine trenches, charged into the exposed inner flank of the Persian cavalry column. The Persians found themselves caught in what military historians call a double envelopment. The cavalry they'd been fighting to their front suddenly had support. The flank they'd thought was secured by the natural flow of their advance was now under attack from highly mobile Hun archers, and from a direction they hadn't even known was threatened. Germanic cavalry were hitting their rear formations. The geometry Belisarius had created now revealed its full purpose. The trenches hadn't just provided passive defense. They'd channeled the Persian attack into a position where it could be struck from multiple directions simultaneously. The Persians couldn't easily disengage because the trenches prevented rapid lateral movement. They couldn't reinforce because doing so would require navigating around the obstacle system while under fire. And they couldn't pursue the Heruli and Huns when those units pulled back because Byzantine cavalry holding the trench line could sortie out to cut off any pursuit. Within perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, the tactical situation on the Persian right wing collapsed. Procopius records casualties of 3,000 men in this phase of the battle, dead, wounded, or captured. For context, that's a casualty rate of roughly 20–30% of the forces initially committed to the attack, inflicted in less than half an hour of fighting. These are catastrophic losses that would break the combat effectiveness of any unit. Think about what that means. You're a Persian cavalryman who rode into this attack confident in your training, your armor, your numerical superiority. Within 20 minutes, 1 in 4 of your comrades is dead or screaming with wounds. The survivors of the Persian right wing retreated back across the trenches, back through the passages they'd fought so hard to cross, back to their own lines to regroup. The Persian second line opened, ranks to accept the retreating cavalry, a standard tactic to prevent pursuit from turning retreat into rout. But 3,000 men were already out of the battle, and the psychological impact on the survivors and on the Persian forces who'd watched the attack fail was significant. This was not how battles against the Byzantines were supposed to go. Persian tactical doctrine, developed over centuries, emphasized that superior numbers and superior cavalry quality would inevitably prevail. Yet somehow, 25,000 Byzantines had just inflicted devastating casualties on a force of 50,000 Persians in the opening phase of battle. Perozes now faced a decision. He could recognize that the Byzantine defensive system was more sophisticated than anticipated, and withdraw to reconsider his approach. Or he could commit his ultimate reserve, the immortals, the Jaidan, the elite 10,000, who had never failed in battle, to an assault that would break the Byzantine defenses through sheer quality of troops and violence of execution. For a Persian general from the house of Miran, there was only one choice. The Persian right had failed not because of superior Byzantine tactics, but because of insufficient force applied. The solution was to apply overwhelming force at a different point. The Persian left wing under Bersmanas would now attack the Byzantine right with the full weight of the immortals. As the battered Persian right wing reformed, the Persian left wing began its advance. And this time, according to Byzantine sources who'd witnessed the first attack, the ground itself seemed to shake from the mass of armored cavalry moving in formation. The sun glinted off thousands of iron plates. The immortals, whose name derived from the tradition that their ranks were always kept at full strength, no matter the casualties, advanced, with the confidence of men who had never been defeated. Belisarius, watching from his command position in the center, had one more card to play. His Bucellarii reserve under John the Armenian, the elite household cavalry he'd been holding back for exactly this moment. But he needed to time the commitment perfectly. Too early, and he'd waste his best troops. Too late, and the Byzantine right wing would break before reserves could save it. The geometry had worked once. Now it had to work again, against the best heavy cavalry in the ancient world. The assault by the Persian left wing began with every advantage tactical doctrine could provide. Bersmanas commanded not just ordinary Savaran heavy cavalry, but the immortals themselves, the Jaidan, encased in iron, mounted on the finest war horses the Sassanid Empire could breed, armed with 12-foot lances that had broken every formation they'd ever charged. Behind them came more waves of Persian cavalry, prepared to exploit whatever breakthrough the immortals achieved. The Byzantine right wing, commanded by Hermogenes and other officers, took their positions behind their section of the forward trench and prepared for the impact. They'd just watched 3,000 Persian cavalry get destroyed on the opposite flank, which must have provided some psychological reassurance that the defensive system could work. But they'd also seen how close that assault had come to breaking through before the hidden reserves intervened. And they knew they were about to face forces that were qualitatively superior to anything that had attacked so far. The charge of the immortals, documented by sources on both sides, was everything Persian tactical tradition promised it would be. The armored cavalry crossed the intervening ground at increasing speed, lances leveled, formation tight. As they reached the trenches, the same thing happened that had slowed the right wing's attack. Horses hesitated. Formation broke at the obstacle. Cavalry compressed at the passages. But the immortals were better trained than ordinary cavalry. More of them made it across. More maintained formation despite the obstacles. And their armor was heavy enough that Byzantine arrows, while inflicting casualties, weren't stopping the charge's momentum. The Byzantine cavalry, defending this sector, began to give ground. Procopius records that they were pushed back from the trench line, forced into a fighting retreat. The Persian cavalry, having forced the initial crossing, now poured more troops across, expanding the breach, threatening to collapse the entire right wing of the Byzantine defensive system. If the right wing broke completely, the Persian cavalry could swing behind the Byzantine center, attacking the infantry from the rear while they were pinned by frontal assault. The entire defensive position would unravel. This was the crisis moment Belisarius had been watching for. His Bucellarii, under John the Armenian, had been held in reserve precisely for this situation, when one sector of the line was on the verge of breaking and required immediate, decisive reinforcement with the highest quality troops available. The Byzantine elite household cavalry charged into the fight, hitting the Persian left wing at the moment of its deepest penetration into Byzantine positions. Procopius describes what happened next. The Byzantine counterattack split the Persian cavalry forces in two. Half the Persian cavalry continued pursuing the Byzantine cavalry that had been forced back. The other half, finding themselves suddenly under attack from an unexpected direction, became separated from their supports and from their commanders. The geometry of the battlefield now worked its mathematics again. The trenches that had been obstacles to the Persian advance now became barriers, preventing the two halves of the Persian force from reuniting. The separated Persian cavalry found themselves in the worst possible tactical situation, fighting on ground controlled by the enemy, unable to receive reinforcements, under attack from multiple directions. And then came the moment that would be recorded in sources on both sides as decisive. According to Procopius, the Hun commander Sunikos, the same man who'd helped destroy the Persian right wing, killed the Persian general Barzmanis in close combat. The sources describe Sunikos personally slaying the one-eyed commander of the Persian left wing. The death of a general in ancient and medieval warfare had effects far beyond the simple loss of one person. Command and control in the 6th century depended on visual recognition of standards and on personal leadership. When Barzmanis fell, his standard fell with him. The troops fighting under his direct command saw their general die. The psychological impact was immediate and cascading. The trapped half of the Persian left wing, now without their commander, fighting in terrain that advantaged the defenders, began to break. What had been an organized attack became a desperate fight for survival. Procopius records casualties of 5,000 Persian dead in this phase of the battle, higher even than the 3,000 lost on the right wing. These numbers, even accounting for possible exaggeration typical of ancient sources, represent catastrophic losses. 8,000 total Persian casualties. From an army of 50,000, that's 16% losses. More critically, these were concentrated among the elite cavalry, the Immortals and Savaron, who represented Persia's decisive arm. The Byzantine cavalry who'd been pushed back now rallied and counterattacked, joining the pursuit of their former pursuers. The half of the Persian left wing that had been chasing them now found themselves being chased. The psychological dynamic completely reversed. Belisarius, demonstrating the same tactical caution that had served him throughout the battle, did not order an all-out pursuit. He was aware that the Persian army, though bloodied, still had intact reserves. He was aware that Dara's safety depended on not overextending his forces beyond the protection of the fortress's artillery. He was aware that Nisibis, with its Persian garrison, lay only 5 kilometers away and could send reinforcements if the Byzantines were caught in the open, pursuing a defeated enemy. The pursuit was allowed to continue for a few miles, according to sources enough to turn defeat into rout, enough to capture standards and prisoners and equipment, but not enough to risk the victory he'd already won. Think about the discipline that required. Your soldiers have just achieved the impossible. They've defeated the Persian Immortals. Every instinct screams, chase them down, finish them completely. But Belisarius knew that victories are often lost in the pursuit, that overconfident armies get ambushed, that the safe option stopping while you're ahead is usually the right option. The Persian army, having lost 8,000 men total, 3,000 on the right, 5,000 on the left, according to Procopius's accounting, retreated first to their camp at Amodius, and then, realizing the position was no longer tenable, back toward the safety of Nisibis. The battlefield belonged to Byzantium. The geometric system had worked beyond Belisarius's most optimistic projections. The trenches had channeled Persian attacks into killing zones. The hidden reserves had struck at critical moments. The refused center had created overlapping fields of fire that supported both wings. And unity of command had allowed rapid commitment of reserves at the decisive point. But battles aren't won in the fighting alone. They're won in what happens afterward, in how the victory is exploited or squandered, in what strategic consequences flow from tactical success. The abandoned Persian camp at Amodius told the story of how completely the defeat had shattered Persian expectations. When Byzantine scouts entered the camp in the hours after the battle, they found evidence of an army that had expected victory so completely they'd brought celebration with them. The camp was looted, yielding arms, gold, and according to some sources, war elephants that had been positioned to support the assault, but never deployed effectively against the trenches and Byzantine archery. These spoils were dispatched to Constantinople as proof of the victory. In the 6th century, when communication moved at the speed of horses and ships, physical evidence was critical to establishing the reality of battlefield claims. The captured Persian equipment, the gold, the standards, the elephants all served as tangible proof that the impossible had occurred. 25,000 Byzantines had decisively defeated 50,000 Persians in open battle. Byzantine casualties, curiously, are not precisely recorded by Procopius. He notes that Belisarius and Hermogenes called off the pursuit after a few miles, fearing the Persians might regroup and counterattack. This caution, which might seem excessive given the scale of the Persian defeat, actually reveals sound tactical judgment. The Byzantine army was not invincible. It had been designed to fight effectively from prepared positions with geometric advantages. Pursuing into open terrain against a desperate enemy with numerical superiority, even a defeated one, risked turning victory into disaster. What we can infer from the sources is that Byzantine losses, while not negligible, were significantly lighter than Persian casualties. The defensive system had worked as designed, maximizing enemy casualties while minimizing friendly losses through engineering and tactical positioning, rather than depending on superior individual combat prowess. The immediate strategic impact was clear. Perozes, the Persian commander who had sent that arrogant message about dining in Dara, retreated to Nisibis in disgrace. According to sources, he was subsequently dishonored by Shah Kavad I for the defeat. Nothing else is recorded about his fate. But in the Sassanid military system, failure of this magnitude by a commander from one of the great noble houses would have had severe consequences for his career and possibly his life. The fortress of Dara, which the Persians had marched to destroy, remained intact. More than intact. It had been validated as a strategic investment. The fortress Anastasius had built in violation of treaty, the fortress Justinian had strengthened despite Persian protests, had just proven its worth by providing the artillery support and secure base that made Belisarius's defensive system possible. For the Eastern Roman Empire, the victory had consequences far beyond the immediate battlefield. For over a century, the Sassanid Empire had dominated the eastern frontier militarily. Byzantine strategy had been defensive, reactive, focused on limiting Persian gains rather than achieving decisive victories. Dara changed the psychological dynamic. Byzantine forces could defeat Persians in the field through superior tactics even when outnumbered. The aura of Persian invincibility was broken. For Belisarius personally, Dara launched his career as what later generations would call the last of the Romans. He was promoted, rewarded, and most importantly, trusted with larger and more important commands. Within 3 years, he would lead the expedition to North Africa that would destroy the Vandal kingdom. By 536, he would be invading Italy to reclaim it from the Ostrogoths. The young general who'd learned from defeat at Thanuris became the commander who won Justinian's wars of reconquest. But Dara didn't end the war. The Iberian War would continue with varying fortunes for both sides. In 531, less than a year after Dara, Belisarius would face the Persians again at a place called Callinicum. That battle, fought on Easter Sunday against Belisarius's judgment, when his troops forced an engagement after fasting, would result in Byzantine defeat. The lesson of Dara, that tactical brilliance could overcome numerical inferiority, had limits. Remove the prepared ground, remove the geometric advantages, and superior numbers could still prevail. The war's conclusion came not from battlefield dominance by either side, but from political change. In September 531, Shah Kavad I died. His son Khosrow, whose proposed adoption had contributed to the war's outbreak, succeeded to the throne, facing domestic threats and challenges to his legitimacy. Khosrow needed stability, not expensive frontier wars. Emperor Justinian, meanwhile, had been planning for years to reclaim the Western Mediterranean territories lost when the Western Roman Empire fell in 476, North Africa under the Vandals, Italy under the Ostrogoths, even parts of Spain. Justinian dreamed of restoration, but these campaigns required resources, and resources meant ending the Persian War. In spring 532, negotiations began between the new Persian Shah and the Byzantine Emperor, both of whom needed peace for different reasons. By September 532, they signed what they called the Eternal Peace. The terms reveal who negotiated from strength. The Byzantines paid 11,000 pounds, 5,000 kilograms, of gold to the Persians, ostensibly for defense of Caucasian passes against nomadic incursions, but functionally a tribute payment. However, Dara, the fortress whose construction had been one of the war's causes, was retained by the Byzantines. The Dux of Mesopotamia was moved from Dara to Constantina, reducing political provocation while maintaining the strategic asset. Territorial exchanges were mutual. Forts seized by either side in Lazica and Persian Armenia were returned. The Iberian rebels who'd fled to Byzantine territory were allowed to remain safely or return home without persecution. The treaty's name, the Eternal Peace, would prove tragically ironic. It lasted exactly 8 years. In 540, Khosrow, now secure on his throne, invaded Byzantine territory, beginning another cycle of wars that would continue intermittently for another century until both empires exhausted themselves, creating the power vacuum that Arab armies would exploit in the 630 seconds. But those 8 years of peace were strategically decisive for Byzantium. They allowed Justinian to launch the Western campaigns that briefly restored something resembling the old Roman Empire. Belisarius conquered the Vandals in 533 to 534. He invaded Italy in 535. By 540, when the Eternal Peace collapsed, the strategic map of the Mediterranean had been redrawn. None of that would have been possible without Dara. The Battle of Dara's legacy extends far beyond the 500-odd years of the Byzantine Empire. Military historians studying the battle in later centuries recognize something that contemporaries might not have fully appreciated. Belisarius had demonstrated a principle that would influence warfare until the age of gunpowder fundamentally changed battlefield dynamics. That principle was this: prepared ground and tactical geometry can multiply force more effectively than superior numbers or superior equipment. It's not an absolute principle. There are limits, as Belisarius himself discovered at Callinicum. But it's a principle that appears again and again in military history whenever weaker forces defeat stronger ones. Consider what Belisarius actually achieved at Dara. He took an army that was qualitatively inferior in cavalry and quantitatively inferior in total numbers. And through engineering and tactical planning, he created conditions where those inferiorities became irrelevant. The trenches negated the Persian advantage in shock cavalry. The geometry created overlapping fields of fire that multiplied Byzantine archery effectiveness. The hidden reserves allowed him to fight with interior lines, while the Persians operated on exterior lines despite their numerical advantage. The refused center invited attacks on the wings where Byzantine strengths in defensive fighting and mobility could be leveraged. This wasn't genius in the sense of inspired battlefield improvisation. It was genius in the sense of methodical analysis of the problem, systematic design of a solution, and disciplined execution of the plan. Belisarius had learned from defeat, studied the principles that had beaten him, and applied those principles with improvements his teachers hadn't imagined. Medieval military treatises would study Dara for centuries. The Byzantines themselves would use similar defensive systems in later battles, though rarely with the same geometric sophistication or the same decisive results. The combination of field fortifications with mobile reserves would become a standard tactical approach for defending armies throughout the Middle Ages. But Dara's influence extended beyond purely military spheres. The battle validated fortress construction as strategic investment. Dara itself, the fortress whose existence had contributed to the war's outbreak, proved its worth so decisively that it remained a Byzantine stronghold for decades. The strategic principle that permanent fortifications could anchor mobile field armies and create local defensive superiority, even against numerically superior enemies, would guide Byzantine military policy for centuries. The battle also validated the career and methods of Belisarius himself. His approach to warfare, emphasizing intelligence, preparation of the battlefield, defensive positioning to negate enemy advantages, calculated use of reserves, and unity of command became the Byzantine style of warfare. Later, Byzantine generals would study his campaigns, and Byzantine military manuals would codify the principles he demonstrated at Dara. In a broader historical sense, Dara represented one of the last great tactical innovations of the ancient world transitioning into the medieval world. The Roman legion was centuries in the past. The medieval knight was still evolving. The 6th century represented a transitional period in military organization and tactics, and Belisarius's victory demonstrated that military genius wasn't dying with the old Roman Empire. It was adapting to new realities. The trenches at Dara, though long since filled and eroded, represented something more than field fortifications. They represented the application of mathematical and engineering principles to warfare in ways that anticipated much later developments. The idea that the battlefield itself could be shaped to advantage the defender, that terrain wasn't just a given condition, but could be actively modified to support tactical goals. These concepts would remain relevant through World War I's trench warfare and beyond. Procopius, who witnessed the battle and recorded it in unprecedented detail, understood he was documenting something significant. His account of Dara is among the most detailed descriptions of any late Roman battle, precisely because he recognized the tactical sophistication of what Belisarius had achieved. Modern military historians analyzing Procopius's account against archaeological evidence from the battlefield site have confirmed the essential accuracy of his tactical descriptions. The trenches were real. The geometry was real. The tactical sophistication was real. This is important to understand. We're not dealing with legend or mythologized history. We have an eyewitness account by a trained observer who understood he was watching military innovation in action. Procopius was Belisarius's legal secretary. He traveled with the general, witnessed his campaigns firsthand, and had access to tactical planning discussions. When he describes the trench system's geometry with specific details about angles and positioning, he's not inventing, he's documenting. When archaeological surveys in the 20th and 21st centuries confirmed stone markers along trench lines at the Dara battlefield site, they validated what Procopius had written 1,500 years earlier. Think about what that means for our understanding of ancient warfare. We often assume that ancient battles are shrouded in myth, that we can't really know what happened. But at Dara, we can. We have documentary evidence and physical evidence that align. We know the trenches existed. We know their approximate layout. We know the tactical principles they embodied. And we know they worked exactly as designed. But perhaps the most important legacy of Dara was what it taught about the relationship between tactical innovation and strategic opportunity. Belisarius's victory didn't just defeat 50,000 Persians. It created the strategic window that allowed Justinian's entire program of Western reconquest. Without Dara, there's no peace treaty. Without the peace treaty, there's no invasion of North Africa. Without the Vandalic campaign's success, There's no Italian campaign. Without the Italian campaign, the Ostrogothic kingdom survives, and the Byzantine Empire remains confined to the east. The trenches Belisarius dug in June 530 weren't just defensive works. They were the foundation upon which the last great attempt to restore the Roman Empire was built. That the restoration ultimately failed, that the reconquered territories would be lost again within decades or centuries, doesn't diminish the significance of the moment when it seemed possible. Dara proved that tactical genius could still matter, that individual commanders could still shape history through intelligence and innovation, rather than just superior resources, and that the discipline and engineering skill of classical civilization hadn't vanished with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire would survive for another 9 centuries after Dara. The Sassanid Empire would fall to Arab conquest within a century. But on one day, in June 530, the outcome of that long struggle between the successors of Rome and the successors of Persia came down to geometry, engineering, and one general's understanding that ground is everything. The battlefield at Dara still exists, though the fortress itself is mostly ruins. The site lies in modern Turkey, in Mardin province near the Syrian border. The valley where Belisarius dug his trenches is still there, constrained by the same hills that anchored his defensive system 15 centuries ago. Archaeological surveys have confirmed the general topography Procopius described and identified markers suggesting organized military construction. You can visit, though the site is in a region that has seen conflict and instability in recent decades. The ruins of Dara Fortress, with its walls and towers built by Anastasius and strengthened by Justinian, are partially preserved. Standing there, looking at the valley where 25,000 men defeated 50,000 through tactical innovation and engineering, you can still sense the geometry that shaped history. But we should step back from the grand strategic implications and remember the human story at the heart of Dara. A 25-year-old general who'd already failed, who'd been defeated and humiliated at Thanuris, who spent 2 years stationed at a fortress, analyzing his defeat, studying his enemy's tactics, and designing a solution. That's the real lesson of Dara, not just that engineering multiplies force, but that failure can be education if you're willing to learn. Think about Belisarius's psychological journey. You're 25 years old. You've been given command because of your connection to the emperor, not because of proven battlefield success. Your first major engagement is a disaster. You're crushed by Persian forces using tactics you didn't understand. Most people in that situation would make excuses, blame their soldiers, blame bad luck, blame the enemy's numerical superiority. Belisarius did something harder. He admitted he'd been outthought. He studied why he lost. He recognized that the Persians had used field fortifications to control the battlefield, to channel his attack, to negate his advantages. And then this is the crucial part. He didn't just copy their tactics. He improved them. He took the basic principle of using trenches to channel enemy movement and added geometric complexity that created overlapping fields of fire, divided enemy forces into sectors that couldn't support each other, and allowed him to fight with interior lines despite numerical inferiority. That's not just learning from failure. That's transforming failure into innovation. The chronicles don't tell us what Belisarius thought during those 2 years at Dara, between his defeat at Thanuris and his victory at the same fortress. But we can infer from his actions. He was analyzing, calculating, designing. He was turning humiliation into education, and education into revolution. When Perozes marched toward Dara in June 530, he was facing a different general than the one who'd been defeated at Thanuris. Not because Belisarius had become more experienced or more courageous, but because he'd become more thoughtful. He'd learned to see warfare not as a contest of courage or strength, but as a problem to be solved through engineering and mathematics. The message Perozes sent "Prepare me a bath and lunch inside your fortress tomorrow," wasn't just arrogance. It was a reasonable assessment based on historical precedent. The Sassanid Empire hadn't lost a major field battle to Byzantium in over a century, but history is made by people who refuse to accept that precedent determines possibility. Belisarius had studied that century of Persian victories. He'd identified the common factors: Persian cavalry superiority in open terrain, Byzantine inability to match Persian shock cavalry, the mathematical advantage of 2-to-1 numerical superiority, and he'd designed a battlefield where none of those factors mattered. The trenches negated cavalry advantage, the geometry negated numerical superiority, the hidden reserves created tactical surprise. The wind, pure meteorological luck, helped in the archery phase, but the fundamental victory came from engineering, not fortune. When the Persians retreated after losing 8,000 men, they weren't just defeated, they were confused. This wasn't how battles were supposed to go. They'd done everything right according to their tactical doctrine, and yet they'd lost catastrophically. That confusion is visible in Persian sources discussing Dara. They don't blame Perozes for cowardice or incompetence. They recognize he faced something they hadn't encountered before. A Byzantine general who understood that the battlefield itself could be a weapon, who'd turned dirt and geometry into a force multiplier more effective than any cavalry charge. The Eternal Peace, signed in 532, gave Justinian 8 years. 8 years to attempt the impossible, reconquering the Western Mediterranean territories lost when the Western Roman Empire fell in 476. Without Dara, those 8 years don't exist. Without Dara proving that Byzantium could defeat Persia in the field, the peace negotiations would have been very different, probably involving Byzantine territorial concessions rather than just gold payment. Without Dara validating Belisarius as a military genius, Justinian doesn't trust him with the North African campaign that begins the reconquest. So when we talk about Dara's legacy, we're really talking about how one battle in a dusty Mesopotamian valley in June 530 made possible the last great attempt to restore Roman control over the Mediterranean. The North African campaign of 533 to 534 destroyed the Vandal kingdom in less than a year. Belisarius landed with approximately 15,000 men and conquered a kingdom that had ruled the richest provinces of the old Western Empire for nearly a century. He used the same principles that won at Dara: careful preparation, tactical innovation, controlling the terms of engagement. The Vandals had superior cavalry. Belisarius used terrain and positioning to negate that advantage. The Italian campaign that began in 535 was more protracted. It would eventually take decades and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. But the initial victories were stunning. Belisarius conquered Sicily, invaded mainland Italy, besieged and captured Naples, and entered Rome itself by December 536. For a brief moment, really just a few years, in the 530 seconds and 540 seconds, it seemed possible that the Roman Empire might actually be restored, that the disasters of the 5th century might be reversed through military genius and imperial ambition. It didn't last. The Gothic Wars dragged on for decades. The reconquered territories proved impossible to hold against persistent enemies and plague-weakened populations. Justinian's dream of restoration ultimately failed. But for 8 years after Dara, it seemed achievable. And that possibility, that brief window when ancient Roman glory seemed within reach, was opened by trenches dug in June 530. Think about the chain of causation. Belisarius loses at the Neris in 528. He studies his defeat for 2 years. He wins at Dara in 530, using improved versions of the tactics that defeated him. That victory makes the Eternal Peace possible in 532. That peace frees resources for Western campaigns, beginning in 533. By 540, when the peace collapses and Khosrow the Fard invades again, the strategic map has been redrawn. North Africa is Byzantine, Much of Italy is Byzantine. The dream of restoration, however temporary, has been achieved. None of that happens if 25,000 Byzantines don't defeat 50,000 Persians on a June day in 530. The trenches at Dara didn't just defeat an army. They opened a strategic window that changed Mediterranean history. That's why military historians still study this battle 1,500 years later, not just for the tactical innovation, but for the strategic consequences that flowed from tactical success. When Procopius wrote his detailed account of Dara, he understood he was documenting a turning point. He'd witnessed a battle where engineering defeated cavalry, where geometry multiplied force, where a young general who'd learned from defeat designed a battlefield that turned his weaknesses into strengths. And he understood that this wasn't just a military victory, it was the beginning of Justinian's attempt to restore the Roman Empire, the beginning of campaigns that would redraw Mediterranean political geography, the beginning of a brief moment when ancient glory seemed recoverable through modern innovation. That it all eventually failed doesn't diminish what was achieved. Belisarius proved that tactical genius could still change history. That one brilliant commander with inferior resources could defeat superior forces through intelligence and engineering. That's eternal, even when peace treaties called eternal last only 8 years. So why should you care about a battle fought 1,500 years ago in a region most people can't find on a map? Because Dara teaches principles that transcend time and technology. Principle 1. Preparation defeats improvisation. Belisarius spent 2 years analyzing his defeat and designing a solution. When battle came, he wasn't reacting. He was executing a plan refined over months of calculation. The Persians, confident in their superiority, improvised responses to a battlefield they didn't understand. Preparation 1. Principle 2. Control the variables that matter. Belisarius couldn't match Persian cavalry quality or numerical strength, so he didn't try. He controlled the battlefield geometry, the positioning, the timing of reserve commitments. He fought the battle on terms that negated Persian advantages and maximized Byzantine strengths. Principle 3. Learn from defeat more than victory. Winning teaches you that what you did worked. Losing, if you study it honestly, teaches you why you failed. Belisarius's greatest teacher was the Persian general who defeated him at Thanuris. He learned those lessons and applied them with improvements his teacher never imagined. Principle 4. Engineering multiplies force. 25,000 men with shovels created defensive advantages that negated 50,000 warriors with superior cavalry. The trenches at Dara were force multipliers more effective than any weapon technology. That principle remained true through World War I and remains relevant today. Principle 5. Tactical innovation creates strategic opportunity. Dara didn't just defeat an army, it opened the strategic window for Justinian's reconquest. One battle's tactical success cascaded into strategic consequences that reshaped Mediterranean politics for decades. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're principles that apply whenever weaker forces face stronger ones, whenever innovation confronts tradition, whenever someone refuses to accept that precedent determines possibility. Modern military academies still study Dara because these principles transcend Bronze Age, Iron Age, Gunpowder Age, or Information Age. They're fundamental truths about how conflict works when you're outnumbered and outgunned but not outthought. Belisarius at Dara proves that genius matters, that one brilliant mind properly applied can change outcomes that mathematics says are predetermined. That preparation, engineering, and understanding of principles can defeat superior resources. In business, that's the startup defeating the established competitor. In sports, that's the underdog using innovative tactics to beat the favorite. In any competitive domain, it's the principle that intelligence and preparation can overcome raw advantage. But there's a darker lesson too. All of this was temporary. Dara's victory led to the eternal peace that lasted 8 years. The Western reconquest succeeded briefly, then failed permanently. Byzantine power declined despite Belisarius's genius. The Sassanid Empire fell to Arab conquest within a century. Both empires that fought at Dara are gone, their names preserved mainly in history books. The fortress itself is ruins. The trenches are filled and eroded. Tactical brilliance can win battles. Strategic vision can win campaigns. But civilizations rise and fall according to forces larger than any battlefield. That's the bittersweet truth. Belisarius was right about everything that mattered in June 530. His trenches worked perfectly. His geometry multiplied force exactly as calculated. His tactical innovation defeated an army that shouldn't have been beatable. And yet, looking at the long arc of history, it only delayed the inevitable. Byzantium's eastern frontier would eventually collapse. The attempt to restore the Roman Empire would ultimately fail. The engineering genius displayed at Dara would be forgotten for centuries, until rediscovered by military historians. Does that mean it didn't matter? No. It means that even when ultimate victory is impossible, tactical brilliance in the moment can still change history. But we should remember the 8,000, because behind every impressive casualty ratio, behind every tactical innovation, behind every military genius's triumph, there are individual human beings who died so the victory could be won. 8,000 Persians died at Dara, 5,000 on the left wing, 3,000 on the right. According to Procopius's accounting, each one was a person, someone's son, brother, father, warriors who'd trained for years, who'd ridden toward Dara expecting victory, who died confused by a battlefield that didn't behave as doctrine predicted. The immortals who charged the Byzantine right wing were elite soldiers from noble families. Their training began in childhood. Their equipment represented generational wealth. They'd never failed in battle before. And on one June afternoon, thousands of them died in trenches dug by an enemy they'd viewed as inferior. Byzantine casualties, which Procopius doesn't precisely record, were lighter but still significant. Soldiers who held the shield wall, while cavalry charged their flanks. Archers who maintained disciplined fire while armored lancers thundered toward them. Cavalry who sortied from the trenches knowing they might not make it back. Every tactical decision Belisarius made was essentially an equation where variables were human lives. Position these soldiers here, some will die, but the tactical advantage gained will save more lives elsewhere. Commit reserves, now casualties increase, but breakthrough is prevented. War, even when brilliantly executed, even when defending civilization, even when victory changes history, is still humanity's greatest horror. Smart generalship means killing the enemy more efficiently than they kill you. Tactical genius means organizing slaughter with precision. Belisarius understood this. There's no record of him celebrating Dara's victory with triumph. He was too aware of what victory cost, not just in Persian dead, but in Byzantine soldiers who'd followed his orders into trenches to face cavalry charges that terrified them. The difference between Belisarius and lesser commanders wasn't that he cared less about casualties. It's that he understood the mathematical necessity of accepting casualties to achieve objectives while minimizing those casualties. Through superior planning, the trenches at Dara saved Byzantine lives by controlling where and how combat occurred. But they didn't eliminate combat, they just made it more efficient. And efficiency in warfare means death delivered with precision. We celebrate Belisarius as a military genius, and he was. But genius in warfare means efficiently organizing the death of other human beings. The most brilliant tactical mind in the world is still orchestrating slaughter. That's not to diminish what he achieved. Dara saved the Byzantine Empire's eastern frontier. The strategic window it opened allowed campaigns that briefly restored Roman control over the Mediterranean. The tactical principles validated at Dara would influence military doctrine for 1,000 years. But let's remember the price: 8,000 Persian dead. unknown numbers of Byzantine casualties, families destroyed, warriors who trained their entire lives dying in a foreign valley because their commanders didn't understand the geometry that trapped them. The Persians who fought at Dara weren't evil invaders, they were soldiers, following orders from their Shah, believing they were defending Persian interests, expecting to win based on historical precedent. The Byzantines weren't noble defenders of civilization, they were soldiers who'd built a fortress in violation of treaty and defended it through superior engineering when the inevitable response came. Both sides were humans, doing their jobs. Soldiers, following orders. Warriors, executing doctrine. And 8,000 of them died in a few hours, because two empires couldn't resolve their differences without violence. Here's the truly sobering perspective. Everything we've discussed, Belisarius's genius, Dara's tactical innovation, the strategic window that opened, Justinian's dream of restoration, all of it was temporary. The Byzantine Empire survived another 923 years after Dara, before Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453. The Sassanid Empire lasted just 111 years after Dara, before being destroyed by Arab conquest in the 652nd. Both empires that fought at Dara are gone. Their successors created new civilizations. The languages they spoke are dead or dramatically changed. The fortresses they built are ruins or tourist sites. Standing at Dara today, if you can visit the site in southeastern Turkey, you see stones and eroded earthworks, the valley where engineering defeated cavalry, the hills that anchored Belisarius's defensive system, the ruins of walls that once seemed permanent, and you realize that nothing lasts forever. Not empires, not victories, not even the battlefield engineering that seemed so revolutionary in 530 AD. Does that mean Dara didn't matter? That Belisarius's genius was meaningless because his empire eventually fell? No. It means that even temporary victories can shape history. Even doomed civilizations can achieve moments of brilliance. Even when ultimate success is impossible, tactical excellence in the moment still matters. Dara mattered because it changed what happened next. It opened 8 years of peace that allowed Western campaigns. It validated tactical principles that influenced warfare for centuries. It proved that intelligence and engineering could defeat superior force. That Byzantium eventually fell doesn't erase what Belisarius achieved any more than the fact that we all eventually die erases the significance of what we accomplish in life. Here's what makes Dara eternally relevant. It proves that one brilliant person can change outcomes that mathematics says are predetermined, that preparation defeats improvisation, that controlling the variables that matter beats having superior resources. These principles transcend any specific empire or era. They're fundamental truths about competition, conflict, and human achievement. When you're facing impossible odds, when every probability calculation says you'll fail, when conventional wisdom says retreat is your only option, when everyone expects you to lose, remember Belisarius at Dara. He was outnumbered 2-1. His cavalry was inferior. His infantry was unreliable. He'd already been defeated once by the same enemy. Every tactical manual said withdraw. He dug trenches with geometric precision. He positioned reserves with mathematical calculation. He turned the battlefield itself into a weapon, and he won. Not because he was braver, because he was smarter. Not because he had better soldiers, because he used the soldiers he had more effectively. Not because he had superior resources, because he controlled the variables that actually mattered. That's the eternal lesson of Dara. Intelligence defeats strength. Preparation defeats tradition. Engineering defeats cavalry. Geometry defeats numbers. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most unlikely generals write the most enduring victories. The trenches Belisarius dug are gone now, filled by centuries of erosion and time. The fortress walls are ruins. The empires that fought there are dust. But the principles validated at Dara remain true. Ground is everything. Preparation multiplies force. Genius can change history. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't what you carry, it's what you dig. So here we are, 1,494 years after June 530 AD. What does Dara actually mean? What should we remember about a battle most people have never heard of, fought between empires that no longer exist, in a valley that's now mostly just archaeological ruins? We should remember this: 25,000 men defeated 50,000, not through superior courage or better equipment or divine intervention, but through engineering and mathematics. A 25-year-old general who'd already tasted humiliating defeat spent 2 years analyzing why he lost, studying his enemy's tactics, and designing a geometric solution that would turn his weaknesses into strengths. When the Persian commander sent that arrogant message, "Prepare me a bath and lunch inside your fortress tomorrow," he was expressing reasonable confidence based on a century of historical precedent. The Sassanid Empire hadn't lost a major field battle to Byzantium in over 100 years. Belisarius looked at those same historical precedents and saw patterns. Persian victories came from cavalry superiority in open terrain. Byzantine defeats came from trying to match that superiority directly. The solution wasn't better cavalry. It was controlling the geometry of the battlefield, so cavalry superiority became irrelevant. The trenches at Dara were force multipliers more effective than any weapon technology. They channeled 50,000 warriors into killing zones. They absorbed the kinetic energy of cavalry charges. They divided the Persian army into sectors that couldn't support each other. They gave Byzantines interior lines, despite numerical inferiority, and they worked perfectly. 8,000 Persians dead, the Persian retreat, the fortress saved, the strategic window opened. Think about that next time someone tells you the odds are insurmountable. Next time conventional wisdom says retreat is your only option. Next time everyone expects you to fail because you're outnumbered, outgunned, or out-resourced. Belisarius was all of those things at Dara, and he won by being smarter than everyone else. If this story changed how you think about innovation, preparation, or the power of engineering and intelligence over brute force, hit that subscribe button. Because there are dozens more stories like this, battles where genius defeated numbers, moments where tactical innovation changed history, victories that prove mathematics and preparation beat strength and tradition. Drop a comment. What shocked you most? That a 25-year-old who'd already lost designed the winning system? That trenches could defeat the elite immortals? That wind direction affected the arrow storm? That 8,000 casualties came from geometric precision? That this battle opened the strategic window for Justinian's reconquest? Share this video with someone who thinks they're facing impossible odds. Someone who needs to understand that intelligence beats strength, that preparation defeats improvisation, that controlling the variables that matter trumps having superior resources. Because Belisarius faced 50,000 Persians with 25,000 exhausted Byzantines, inferior cavalry, unreliable infantry, and a recent history of defeat. And he won by understanding that the battlefield itself could be a weapon. June 530 AD, 25,000 against 50,000. Trenches against cavalry. Geometry against tradition. Engineering against empire. And the trenches won. Now you know why the battles nobody's heard of sometimes matter more than the famous ones everyone knows. Why tactical innovation can open strategic windows that change civilizations. Why one brilliant mind, refusing to accept that precedent determines possibility, can achieve what mathematics says is impossible. I'll see you in the next one, where we'll explore another moment when someone refused to accept defeat and changed history through intelligence and preparation. Until then, remember Dara, remember Belisarius, remember that the most powerful weapon isn't always what you carry. Sometimes it's what you dig